Every story has a beginning, and every story eventually arrives to an ending. Throughout its 4-year history, GTFO has given us hundreds of lore logs to discover and process. Through these logs, a fragmented story was slowly pieced together. And while many of the game's subplots seem to have been left incomplete, the primary story that began long before our crew of prisoners stepped onto the scene reached its conclusion at the end of Rundown 8. And today, we'll be looking over said story from start to finish. A story of an underground facility. A story of a world-ending virus. A story of dimensions merging together. A story of how we finally managed to GTFO. Every story must begin somewhere, and similar to my own, our story here starts off with an earthquake, specifically the Merida earthquake of April 2049. This earthquake in the Yucatan opened up a sinkhole, which was offered to private mining contractors and would later find itself in the hands of the Santonian Mining Company in the month of June. Although the methods of which they acquired the land seem to have been shady at best. Now, the Santonian Mine Company wanted to own the land in order to start construction of a giant underground mining facility, which would be known as Garganta. The purpose of this facility was to gain access to a massive vein of iridium that was deep underground. At a rough estimate, the amount of iridium in the vein would be worth $300 billion. The price of iridium was skyrocketing around this time, and SMC stocks were also increasing due to them being the market leaders of rare mineral and metal farming. However, the timing of this all seemed a little too convenient. As reported by a radio broadcast known as State of Truth AM, this earthquake wasn't natural. This was the biggest recorded earthquake in history, and it transpired in an area with minimal seismic activity. It wasn't possible for this earthquake to occur naturally, and the fact that it also happened to open up a sinkhole to the largest vein of iridium, the most valuable material on Earth, was just too fishy. And the frosting on this fishy cake was the fact that SMC got the contract to the land just a few months after the earthquake. A contract that would have taken any other company years to obtain. Even though no concrete evidence existed at the time, it almost seemed as if SMC knew about the iridium vein beforehand and somehow caused the earthquake themselves to not only open up the sinkhole for them to mine it, but to also remove any unwanted people from the land. And I want you to keep that in mind as we go further into the lore. Fast forwarding to the year of 2050, the construction of Garganta was underway. And an important thing to understand is that there were 4 primary departments that were a part of the complex Garganta. The first one being SMC, which we already mentioned. They were the ones who were in charge of mining out and constructing the facility, and underneath them were a plethora of other smaller contracted companies. Neoxys, Techman Defense, Alpha, Cornell Industries, Omnico, and many others. And you may recognize some of those company names as you see them over and over again while you play the game, assuming you pay close attention to the logos found all over the place in the complex. The second department to know about, though, would be Kovac Defense Services, and they're probably the biggest name to keep an eye on. Kovac was well known throughout the world, as they offered their defense services to hundreds of companies, and while extremely effective, their methods weren't always smiled upon. But because they were so effective, a lot of people kind of just brushed that detail under the rug. On July 21st, 2050 though, a head member of Kovac reached out to Garganta offering their services, stating that they could provide not only military support, but also data protection so that they could keep everything they were doing down at Garganta a secret from the rest of the world, and not too long afterwards, their offer was accepted and they were brought on board. But that's not all there was to Kovac. They were also the ones who created HSU technology. Those pods that you come out of and return to whenever you drop down to an expedition and you sometimes see in other levels, yeah, that's them. The HSUs were used as a part of the Legion program, which of course was also something that Kovac created. The Legion program was a large collection of mostly unwilling personnel whose memories were erased through the use of hydrostasis, as exposure or being in hydrostasis for too long would slowly but surely chip away pretty much everything you remembered. And once most of their memories were gone, they were fashioned into loyal mercenaries that could be remotely controlled and given orders to through control chips. After some time, the Legion program was the primary means of defense and security down in Garganta. But that wasn't quite all there was to it, because they needed an effective way to handle the Legion program, which was done through the use of the Biocom system. Biocom was developed by Kovac to fully and automatically control basically everything down in Garganta. The Legionnaires, power, security, communications, resource management, it was all handled by Biocom. Now, it took some time for all this to actually be set up. This didn't all occur in the year 2050, but once in place, Kovac effectively had control of all of Garganta. Biocom and the Legion program handled nearly all the facility security, while Centennial Mine Company continued to mine and build deeper into the earth. But like I said earlier, there are 4 we had to keep an eye on, and that's only 2 of them. The other 2 major departments were Project Rise and Project Insight. Project Rise was technically another part of Kovac. However, their focus was to find a way to create life and clone it, so instead of grabbing death row inmates and people who needed to disappear for the Legion program, they could build soldiers from the ground up and perfect them. In a way, they wanted to create superhumans that would infinitely supply the Legion program for the rest of time. Project Insight, on the other hand, was a research group. As SMC continued to delve deeper into the Earth, they came across otherworldly artifacts and bizarre creatures that had never been seen before. And with all these amazing discoveries, they realized they needed a proper research team down in Garganta, as SMC and Kovac weren't really capable of actually going deep into the research of all of these unknown things they were coming across. So after a while, Project Insight was brought on board, and they were in charge of all the research. And with these 4 groups in place, work continued in the facility for multiple years. Garganta had become a joint effort, massive underground and fairly secretive mining and research facility. And as time went on, everything seemed to be fine and dandy, with a few small issues here and there down in the complex. SMC continued to expand Garganta as they made their way closer to the massive vein of iridium, but as they got closer to it, they realized that it wasn't quite what they originally thought it was. In one of the many logs, we see a report explaining that the entire vein down there wasn't comprised of iridium, but rather only 3% of it was. The rest was comprised of elements and ores known to mankind, aside from one, which was later named Cretaceum-77A by Project Insight. Upon further inspection through scans in the Earth, it was determined that the strange artifact wasn't a natural occurrence, but something artificially created. Inside the artifact were several large clear tubes that all seemed to connect to the center point of the mass. Unable to learn much more though through scans alone, it was decided that SMC would still continue to make their way to the artifact and breach the Cretaceum-77A walls in order to explore the chambers within and figure out exactly what this thing was. But unknowingly, this decision of theirs would later cause the end of the world. Going into 2052, sickness started afflicting SMC workers and pretty much anybody else down in Garganta. And this wasn't a simple cold, but something that would later be known as the NAM-V virus. Unbeknownst to those in Garganta, NAM-V was a world-ending disease. It was highly contagious and transmittable, and those unfortunate enough to catch it were almost guaranteed to experience a painful death, or something even worse if they turned out to be unlucky. It wouldn't be later until mid-2054 where researchers from Project Insight learned that NAM-V was an extraterrestrial virus that had a symbiotic relationship with parasites. The virus would cause life-prolonging chemicals to produce in the parasites, and in return, the parasites would transmit the virus to other hosts. The virus would then alter the behavior of the new host to make them accept the presence of the parasite and prevent any desire to remove it. But that's only the beginning of the virus. The virus mutated with every new host to the point where millions of versions existed, which caused it to be nearly impossible to find a cure for. And as I said earlier, sometimes hosts would just simply die off because of the virus, but in other cases, they would actually turn into some of the creatures that we saw down below. And there are research articles that show that some of these creatures, not all, but some of them, did have human DNA, which confirms that they did come from a human origin. The only temporary cure that the researchers could eventually come up with was hydrostasis, as the process of hydrostasis effectively put whoever was put into it into a borderline death suspension. Everything ceases to function inside of hydrostasis, which would result in the death of the virus. However, this was only a temporary cure, as one could easily become infected again shortly after leaving hydrostasis, and even learning this much information about the virus took Project Insight way too many years for it to actually be effective. At first, NAM-V was only a problem for those down in Garganta, and despite the higher-ups telling everyone that they had it under control and that NAM-V posed no serious threat to any of them, this was only the beginning of the end. Within just a couple of months, the suicide rate of workers in Garganta was rising to alarming levels. Roughly 1/3 of the workforce reported having psychological disturbances, which was just one of the many signs and side effects of NAM-V. And with people down below realizing their lives were no longer valued by the higher-ups, and that sticking around would more than likely lead to their death, some of them tried to escape. Now, at this point, entry and leave from the facility was strictly prohibited, and those brave enough to try were often killed by Kovac on site. However, one lucky, or perhaps unlucky, individual managed to escape on December 28, 2052. From here, this person fled up north to Florida, and just a couple months later, the virus was rapidly spreading throughout the state and grabbing the attention of everybody. But it wasn't just the states that would end up suffering from this outbreak. Within the same month of Florida, the virus made its way all the way over to England, and the World Health Organization declared NAM-V to be a Class 6 global pandemic. From here, NAM-V would continue to rapidly spread throughout the world and not so slowly bring nearly all life to an end. There was no stopping this virus, and though the world desperately looked for a cure, there just wasn't enough time to find it before nearly all life on Earth would be wiped out. But what about those in Garganta? We jumped ahead a few years to talk about the outside world. So let's dial it back to shortly after the NAM-V virus escaped to the outside world. Now, as I said earlier, thanks to Kovac, what was going on down in Garganta was practically unknown to most of the world. And the same was true the other way around. Those in the facility, aside from the higher-ups, knew very little about what was going on in the outside world. So they just continued their work. Now, security was growing extremely tight, and Kovac was getting to the point where they would kill people for simply being in an area they shouldn't have been in. Those in charge want to learn more about the mysterious artifacts and creatures they kept discovering as they got closer to the unknown Cretaceum-77A mass, so they just said, hey, Kovac, do what you need to do, just make sure people are doing their job and obeying. And bit by bit, over time, the workers started to understand that they weren't really in a great situation, but trying to escape to the outside world more than likely would have led them to death, so they just kept on going. And eventually, they were able to breach the walls of the mass and start to explore the massive inner chambers. The further in they went, the more artifacts and alien-like devices they found, but also the more creatures they encountered. And the creatures, just like they are in-game, were very aggressive. Research teams had to have Kovac units from the Legion program constantly at their side in an attempt to just keep them safe. And even then, that wasn't always enough. And the more they explored, the more variants of the creatures they discovered. And one of the lead researchers from Project Insight, a man by the name of Dr. Hammerstein, wanted to become world famous with his discoveries from down here. He wanted all of the credit for discovering and documenting the hidden secrets of the artifacts, and even went so far as to try and capture some of the creatures so he could put them on display. Through his research, he came to learn that these creatures would react to aural stimulation. No, not oral, aural, meaning sound and hearing. So he decided to conduct an experiment. On October 12, 2053, Dr. Hammerstein conducted a behavioral analysis where he would project a range of frequencies in the lower levels of Garganta, including near the inner, which is what many called the central chamber of that massive Cretaceum-77A structure. And he did this to see how the creatures would react to these frequencies and which one would grab the most attention. However, in a report that was written a few days later, it was shown that things didn't work out quite as well as Dr. Hammerstein had hoped for. While the experiment was being performed, a massive explosion occurred that originated from the inner. This explosion sent out what was described as streams of quark gluon plasma beams. Now, there's a good amount of science I could go into in regard to what those are, but I'll skip the boring nitty-gritty sciencey stuff for the time being. Basically, these beams were highly concentrated energy that disintegrated pretty much anything that was in their path. These streams formed tubes throughout the complex that went almost all the way up to the surface, and this was a good 1,500 or so meters underground, so that's a pretty impressive length. And to some, this just appeared to be some crazy accident where something went wrong for some unknown reason, but hey, we don't get paid enough to look into it, we don't care. But a few individuals looked more into it and realized that there was a lot more to this explosion than people thought there was. First of all, the streams weren't random. They were directed. Through the complex, hordes of sleepers were engaging Kovac squads due to Hammerstein's experiment riling everything up. And nearly all of these streams were directed at those large hordes of sleepers, almost as if it was trying to kill them and save the humans. All the streams also stopped short of the seabed up above, which if even one had penetrated the seabed, the entirety of Garganta would have been flooded. The ability to not only create such powerful QGP beams, but also direct and control how far they went out, was something that researchers described as being beyond our understanding of the physical laws of the universe. Now, we'll come back to this moment in time a little later, but currently we don't have enough information to understand it, and I don't want to make the big reveal quite yet and tie everything together, as there's more we still need to cover. So, what happened next? Well, due to the explosion, a lot of people died, including some of the higher ups who were currently in Garganta. This caused new heads to form and different projects to be initiated. SMC, for the most part, continued to expand the complex and help the researchers from Project Insight continue their studying of the artifacts and the inner. Insight's main goal was to learn more about these artifacts and creatures and the virus that was starting to get completely out of control, killing off a lot of people down in the complex. Through continued research and experimentation, it was learned that certain artifacts, specifically what we know as the matter wave projector and those data cubes, were used for dimensional teleportation. It took a while, but eventually, Insight learned how to use the matter wave projector and started to send out research teams to other dimensions, the first squad being known as the EF-01 group. And some of the members of EF-01 was Frank Bishop, one of the characters that we play as well as a man by the name of Dr. Durant. His name will be important later, so make sure you remember it. And while we don't learn a whole lot about what happened to the EF-01 group, we did receive 2 recordings that were left by Dr. Durant. The first one is him documenting how the group arrived in some sort of jungle-type environment, the place being rich and vibrant and teeming with plant life, but unfortunately their connection to Garganta was severed and they had no way of returning home. So instead, they plan to set up a base and do their best to survive and look for a way to maybe one day get back to Garganta. In the second recording though, Dr. Durant that years have gone by, and all of a sudden the data cubes, which had been dormant the entire time, started to give off frequencies. So they had Bishop take a look at the data cubes, and upon doing so, he vanished. Bishop was gone. And while Dr. Durant was unaware of exactly where Bishop wound up at, it was confirmed in other lore logs that Bishop actually teleported back to Garganta, although he was taken away by Kovac members before any of the researchers were able to ask him questions of what happened to the EF-01 squad. Now, after this point, not a whole lot of other noteworthy stuff occurs down in Garganta. As time went on, the virus and sleepers continued to kill off the last few remaining people, and the biocom system that was supposed to be flawless started to exhibit weird behaviors. Kovac was still doing its job thanks to the biocom system, but a weird virus known as Warden started to take control of it and do a few random tests to see how much control it had. And this was noticed by a few people who were keeping an eye on biocom, but the higher-ups kept telling them to just simply ignore it because there is nothing going wrong. Everything is working as intended, so people stopped focusing on this weird occurrence as there were things that were higher priority for them. Or at least there were until the end of it all. On November 24, 2056, an employee by the name of Nolan Connor left behind a recording announcing that the world was doomed. Nearly everyone outside of Garganta was dead or close to it thanks to the virus, and it was all because of the people down below in the complex. They were the ones who explored deep into the earth and unknowingly unleashed the virus upon the world. Those remaining in Garganta were forbidden to leave the complex, so they had 2 choices. They could either sit there breathing their final breaths as they waited to die either to the creatures, the virus, or just natural causes, or potentially suicide, or they could try one last time to fight the virus. Sealed away in the inner was a chamber with a biomass larger than anything they had ever seen before. Thousands of biosignatures were in that chamber, including one massive organism. And they announced that tomorrow would be the day the remaining few, or at least most of them, would open the chamber and fight one last battle. Now, we don't know exactly what transpired when they opened that chamber, but we can make fairly educated guesses. See, while many of the remaining people went to make their heroic last stand, those in the Legion program did not. And that was because control of the biocom system was completely stripped away from the employees by that mysterious Warden system. Instead of helping them, the Warden used biocom to tell all the deployed Kovac units to return to KDS Deep. KDS Deep being the home of the Legion program, where nearly all of the HSUs were stored. And there, all of the remaining Kovac units stored themselves in hydrostasis, and they were just simply left there to wait. And at this point in time, the outside world was almost entirely killed off by the virus, with only a few remaining people here and there. The remaining workers in Garganta made their heroic last stand and perished to whatever horrors they saw when they opened the doors to the inner, and the Warden system sent all of Kovac into KDS Deep and temporarily went into hibernation. Days, months, years, perhaps decades. We don't know how much time transpired after all these events, but eventually, the Warden system brought things back online. Using biocom, it sent out groups of prisoners from the Legion program to take care of various tasks. Things like restoring power grids, bringing air filtration back online, collecting DNA samples, clearing out sectors, etc. And among these groups of prisoners were, of course, the 4 characters that we play as, but also a squad that consisted of a man who is incredibly important to the remainder of the story. That man being John Schaeffer. Schaeffer started off as a normal prisoner just like the rest of us, but during an expedition, his team met their unfortunate end, or at least 3 of them did. Schaeffer managed to escape, but he didn't return to his hydrostasis unit. Instead, he utilized the ventilation system to explore throughout the complex and tried to break free from the voice of the warden that was constantly in his head telling him to retreat and return to hydrostasis. And eventually, he learned about the control chip on his neck and successfully removed it, although it did cause a bit of damage to his body and mind. And at this point in the story, things might start getting a little bit confusing to some of you. Earlier, I mentioned Insight researchers utilize the matter wave to teleport to other dimensions, and throughout the millions of dimensions that actually existed out there, alternate versions of people also existed. And when it comes to the rest of GTFO story, there are 2 dimensions we need to keep track of. There's the original dimension that consisted of the original rundowns 1 through 7, as well as the second half of rundown 8, and there's the alternate dimension, which consists of alternate rundown 1 through 6, as well as the first half of rundown 8. And the reason I mention this now is because those 2 dimensions and our characters from them at some point towards rundown 8 merge together a little bit, which means we need to have a proper understanding of the differences between those 2 dimensions before we arrive to the finale. So, going back to Schaeffer, in the original dimension, he was far from mentally stable. After breaking free from his control chip, he viewed the warden as an evil mastermind that had to be rebelled against, and his goal was to find more people in the complex and break them free of their programming so they could band together and escape from the complex. Meanwhile, in the alternate dimension, Schaeffer is more open-minded and realizes that while the warden is utilizing the prisoners against their will, there had to be a reason for it all, and therefore he views the warden not as an enemy, but as something that he needed to learn more about before he could make a judgment call. This causes the 2 Schaeffers to go down similar paths, but their objectives were quite a bit different. They both realized that they needed a team to help them accomplish their goals, as they couldn't just simply do all this by themselves. And both of them do eventually come across files on all the prisoners in the Legion program and see that our squad is the most successful one of them all. However, they know we're hard programmed by the warden system and that they can't just simply approach us. Otherwise, they risk their heads getting shot off, which one of the Schaeffers nearly experienced that fate. So, OG Schaeffer decided to contact us through recorded messages and test us to see if we're trustworthy enough to work with him. Alternate Schaeffer, on the other hand, takes time to learn more about the warden and what happened not only down in the complex, but also what occurred to the surface world. Eventually, both of their paths lead them to a mysterious humanoid creature known as a conduit. The conduit was something built by the warden system using the tools left behind by Project Rise, the cloning division of Kovac, if you forgot about them from earlier, since it has been a while since we've mentioned them. And the conduit was the warden's attempt to speak to us on behalf of alien-like entities known as the Collectors. Keep the Collectors in mind because they are the key to the entirety of GTFO's lore. Now, OG Schaeffer fears the conduit as he believes it's a trick left by the warden to deceive him. So instead of speaking with the conduit and figuring things out, he decides to ignore everything that it tries to say and just simply kills it. With the conduit dead, he then continues into Rundown 7, where he works with Henriksen, an engineer he had us help free and remove the warden's control chip from, as well as us, of course, since he's still near a group of prisoners, to inject a virus into the warden system to give us complete control over it. Or rather, I guess I should say, Henriksen and Schaeffer having control of it, and that was the ending of Rundown 7. On the flip side though, alternate Schaeffer learns that the conduit is not a threat, and therefore takes a chance by talking with it. Throughout their short conversation, the conduit explains that it speaks on behalf of the warden, and that the warden is part of the Collectors. The Collectors being entities that traveled throughout the dimensions collecting the virus and anything that it had infected. The Collector's goal was to save any and all dimensions that the virus was present in. However, something happened which caused the collection to become impure. And for the longest time, I didn't realize that the picture the game was trying to build was literally staring at me dead in the eyes. It wasn't until recently when I looked back at the conversation between Schaeffer and the conduit and realized that this number right here had to have some significance meaning. And after a quick internet search, I found that this number translated to approximately 65 million years, which at the time I figured was just simply a large number for the heck of it. It wasn't until I tossed aside that conclusion and looked more into it that I finally connected the dots and realized that 65 million years ago is roughly when people say the asteroid hit the Earth that killed the dinosaurs. The asteroid that landed in the Chicxulub crater, aka the same place that the underground facility Garganta was built at. It was then I learned that it wasn't an asteroid that hit Earth in GTFO's lore, it was an alien spaceship. The spaceship being the one that the collectors traveled across dimensions in while they were collecting and isolating the virus. And once I realized that, nearly all of GTFO's lore up to this point finally pieced together. If you remember, towards the beginning of this video, I mentioned that the State of Truth AM broadcast talked about how the Merida earthquake wasn't natural. And that's because it wasn't. Although it wasn't intentionally caused by SMC like State of Truth thought it was. Rather, it was caused by the collector's spaceship that was buried deep underground. And there's evidence to prove this. If you've got a good memory or have been taking notes while I've been rambling on about the backstory of the game, you recall that the massive explosion that transpired near the core of the inner down at Garganta left behind a lot of tube passageways throughout the complex. The same clear tube passageways that SMC detected in the massive artifact through their scans as they were mining their way towards it. The Merida earthquake was caused by the same type of explosion that occurred a couple years later in Garganta. Now, as for what caused the initial explosion back in 2049, I cannot say with certainty. There is unfortunately not enough evidence to show why that happened. However, the second one that occurred later in Garganta, that one we can explain. As I mentioned earlier, around that time, the complex was being overrun by sleepers due to Dr. Hammerstein's experiment, and the beams that went out from the explosion were directed towards those large groups of sleepers. The collectors had a plan on how they were going to salvage the bad situation they found themselves in because they crashed into the Earth and the virus that they had collected was starting to just spread everywhere. The thing is though, everything they needed for their plan wasn't set quite yet. They still needed the people down in Garganta to do more work. Specifically, they needed Project Rise, the cloning facility, to further their development. That way they could actually create somewhat human living organisms that didn't die off immediately, which is what they were currently at that time. They were able to make clones, but they died so quickly that they really couldn't get anything done. They also needed Project Insight to look more into the artifacts and figure out how to utilize the matter wave projector to create teleportation pads in the complex, because these two things were crucial for their final plan. So they used the explosion to kill off a lot of the sleepers and save the people down Garganta so they could continue their research. And there's one other thing they actually took care of with this explosion, which I almost looked over as I was going through all the lore logs. It was mentioned that one of the head people of SMC was about to head to the surface. The reason for this was because he got tired of all the crap going on down the complex, including the fact that one of his best friends, Igor, got killed by Kovac because he stepped into a restricted area, so he wanted to blow the cover of the entire thing going on down in Garganta and get the world involved to try to shut it down. And he was just about to leave at the time of this explosion, and coincidentally, one of those beams that went out from the explosion went straight to the helipad where Andrew Clinton was located at and killed him in an instant. The collectors knew what they were doing. They knew what they needed to do to ensure their final plan would actually be fulfilled, so they utilized that explosion to kill off any of the factors that would have ruined it. And this all perfectly explains why the explosion there was so unexplainable by human reasonings, because the collectors clearly don't abide by the same rules of physics that we humans do. And this also further explains the weird happenings with the warden hijacking the biocom system, because the biocom system was designed to be impossible for any human to hijack. But for an alien species with advanced technology, it was probably a piece of cake for them. And this also explains why all the Kovac units, instead of helping the last few survivors make their final stand against what was in the inner, instead just simply went back to KDS Deep, because the Warden would need as many units as it could get in order to fulfill its final plan. So it didn't want to waste what it saw as human resources on a futile task. And with Schaeffer having all this information and understand that the plan of the collectors was to utilize the prisoners to find a clean dimension to teleport to and take all of the remaining pure humans to it, he then went and contacted us towards the end of Alternate Rundown 6. There he let us know the basics of what was going on and that he would contact us again at a later date, and he would have us work with him and the Warden to fulfill this plan. And with that, the two separate timelines basically come to their end, because now we arrive at Rundown 8 itself, where everything merged together. Rundown 8 itself was divided into two halves. As I said earlier, the first half was us playing as the alternate cast of characters working with alternate Schaeffer and the Warden to escape from this dimension. In A1, our first step was to retrieve the matter wave projector. In B1, we then collected 3 data cubes, which would be needed in order to pinpoint project ourselves to the correct dimension. In B2, we scrubbed those data cubes clean of their information since they were already programmed with coordinates. And in C1, we download the coordinates of the safe dimension onto the data cubes so we could then use them to teleport. In D1, we were then also meant to meet up with Schaeffer, but something went wrong at the end of it that we didn't have an explanation for until later on. And then finally, in the last mission of the first half, E1, we were meant to make our way to KDS Deep to meet up with Schaeffer and teleport to the new dimension. However, right at the end, we seem to be betrayed by alternate Schaeffer and are instead left to die to an endless horde of sleepers that we have no chance of surviving against. It isn't until we play through the second half of the rundown that we see what truly happened to us. While the alternate characters were doing their task in the first half, the OG squad was working with OG Schaeffer on his plan in the second half, which in the first mission of the second half, A2, we learned that Schaeffer's plan went from escaping the complex like he originally told us to blowing it up and trying to destroy the Warden. Which, yeah, that's not necessarily a great plan. Henriksen actually tried to work with us to break us free of our programming and betray Schaeffer, as he didn't want to die down here. But sadly, Schaeffer learned of the betrayal, and in the next mission, we find an ID badge with a bloody pipe and a trail of blood moving away from it in the zone next to the one that Henriksen told us to meet him in back in A2. And last time I checked, I've never seen a sleeper run at me with a metal pipe, so it's safe to say that this was caused by Schaeffer murdering our boy Henriksen. And with Schaeffer being the only voice in our head and control of the Warden system in this dimension, we have no choice but to obey him. We still have our control chips implanted into us, and Schaeffer, as I said, has control of the biocom system, or at least he did for the first few missions. As we continue to complete tasks for Schaeffer and assist him in causing a nuclear reactor meltdown, the Warden system starts to fight back. Just like the collectors got involved years ago to ensure their plan wouldn't go down the drain, they once again got involved here. They knew that if they didn't interfere, that Schaeffer was going to blow up the complex and everything would fall apart. So, using the Warden system, they fought back against Schaeffer and started giving us different orders, which is why in some of the missions we see our objective constantly flicker back and forth and Schaeffer yelling at us to not obey what the Warden is saying, but instead listen to him. In B4, the Warden had us collect a data sphere which had crucial information on it that the other team needed in order to get the coordinates to the clean dimension. In C2, we then extract the data from that data cube and leave it behind for the other team to collect. And then we made our way to remove our control chips so Schaeffer would no longer have any control over us. In D2, after removing our control chips, we then wander through the reservoirs in order to meet up with the other squad so we can escape with them. But OG Schaeffer refuses to let us have a happy end. Scorned by us betraying him, he plans to confront the alternate Schaeffer to let him know that we're infected with the virus, so there would be no chance of them taking us with them. So we attempt to cut off Schaeffer, but sadly we arrive a little bit too late, and we witness OG Schaeffer beat alternate Schaeffer to death. We then kill OG Schaeffer to stop him from causing any further damage, but it's sadly already too late. The reactor meltdown is in progress and there's nothing we can do to stop it. Our only hope is to now take the Matterwave projector that alternate Schaeffer had with him, trick the other group into giving us their data cubes, and skedaddling to the new dimension without them. Because for some reason, our characters decided that it's either we get to live or they get to live, because compromise was clearly not an option on the table. And that brings us to the final mission of the game. In E2, it's a mad dash for both squads as they scramble to KDS Deep before they're overrun by hordes of sleepers or the nuclear reactor meltdown goes off and blows everything up. Along the way, we boot up the nearby reactor to ensure the KDS teleporter has enough juice to make the jump. And then we also purify the air in the quadrant to try to minimize the chance that we'll be infected by any parasites as we make our final preparations. And once we've taken care of these two tasks, we then arrive at KDS Deep before the other team does, and we trick them into handing over their data cubes. With them in hand, all that's left is to insert the Matterwave projector and hold out one last time while the teleporter charges up. And with everything online, we teleport to the new dimension while also bringing most of the HSUs that were stored in KDS Deep with us, and we walk towards the sunlight. But before everything fades to black, a familiar voice calls out to us. Dr. Durant, the lead person of the EF-01 expedition, tells us to not move as there are traps everywhere. We didn't just simply teleport to a dimension that had never been explored before. We teleported to the dimension that Dr. Durant's team was sent to many years ago. A dimension that was confirmed to be clean of the virus. But is it still clean? One thing that still weighs on my mind after all of this is whether or not we got infected by the virus on our way to KDS Deep. We had to fight through hundreds upon hundreds of sleepers in order to make our daring escape. And with how infectious the virus has been shown to be, there's a very high chance that at least one of us contracted the NOM-V virus before we teleported. And with how rampant and deadly it is, if even one of us brought a single parasite that contained the virus with us to this new dimension, it's game over. So even though in the end we finally managed to GTFO and do what we unknowingly set out to do ever since the beginning, there's a good chance that it was all for naught. In the end, did we truly receive the good ending that we yearned for all these years? Or did we just close the chapter of one nightmare only to begin a new one? And there it is. What will more than likely be the last lore video I ever make for GTFO. For years now, I have been asked time and time again, when is the next lore video going to release, Mr. Scaler? And don't get me wrong, I've enjoyed dissecting the lore of this game, despite it being so confusing and convoluted at times. But with this video, I believe I've covered everything I wanted to when it comes to the lore of the game. As I said earlier, there are quite a few subplots in the game I could try to go into more detail about, but most of them seem to have been left incomplete. The sad truth about the game is that 10 Chambers wanted to create more rundowns beyond Rundown 8 and save the finale for later. They had a lot more story planned for the game originally, but due to financial reasons, they had to wrap the game up sooner rather than later, else they risked GTFO potentially never seeing a proper ending. And I believe for that reason, that's why so many of the subplots that they've been expanding upon over the last few rundowns never did receive their own conclusions like the main story did with Rundown 8. And while there's always the faint possibility that at some point far off into the future, we might see more of GTFO, either through expansions or tinfoil hat me, perhaps even a second game, for the time being, there is nothing left for me to cover. So now I shall at last, after 4 long years, close the final chapter of this story. Peace and tranquility at long last. I might as well enjoy this until Den of Wolves releases and people start pestering me for lore videos on that game. Until next time, everyone.